Faith, Love, Hope Sunday. Here we go. I had someone say a comment to me this morning. Why do we do faith and finance on the same Sunday? Why can't we just separate them? It would make it so much clearer. But I said actually the opposite. I love it when it's mixed together. In the Bible, when finances and faith are mixed together, that's where the power happens. It's like when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and he has the 10 Commandments and he sees his people have built a golden calf and he rips it down. And then his people move on closer to the promised land. There's one thing that God says that can come in that you cannot serve alongside God. It says you cannot serve God and money at the same time. One must submit to the other. And that's why Faith, Love, Hope is so powerful. It's not as if you can buy your miracle, but when you submit to God, when you lay down the idol of this generation, which is money, the thing that promises you the life you've always wanted, but will always underdeliver. When you lay that down to God, when you release that, your faith is no longer attached to it. It reattaches to God. And that's where the open heaven is over people's lives. So tonight, I believe some great things are going to happen. You guys can take your seats as we begin. As Pastor Liam said, there's an amazing moment that happens at the end of service where the crosses are out and you bring that moment. When you do approach that moment, I encourage you to walk at it like it's a holy moment. Not as if you're walking to the front of just a church, but as if you're walking to the altar itself. That when you bring something to God, I've learned this, fire never falls on an empty altar. Fire falls when the altar is set up, when there's something on it to consume. That's when the incense goes up to God. That's what He's pleased with. And so when you do it at the end, it's not just a random church moment. This is a moment, a holy moment before God where you bring something to God and you watch Him bless it. And I also think that moments like this are even more, have a greater gravity around them because I just sense that the next generation, or this generation even, is entering a time of Egypt. When Israel was enslaved to Egypt, they were there for like 400 years enslaved. They couldn't go on to what God called them to be. And I sense a time where there's this generation is coming that it is bound. And not bound to these ideas of the world, but bound to debt, to money, to this spirit of the Antichrist. And it's not a problem that more money can solve to buy out. Nor it is a problem that a vow of poverty can solve. It's only through a surrendered money that there can be a freedom from it. And just like Moses led the people out of this time in Egypt, I strongly sense that the church can lead a generation out of this enslavement to debt by showing the surrendering of money. That money is not a god, that money is not an idol. But it took a free person coming back into and bringing people out, and we must be free people. And so this moment tonight where we give and we sow a seed of faith, and we sow a seed of finance. It's also us freeing ourselves that we can lead people into freedom. Because the old generation, I didn't say old generation, that's a bad word, isn't it? Sorry, I saw Andy and Debbie there. It's a bad word, you don't like me after that. The prior generation, they gave and did to find out what it meant to be good. But our generation, the next generation, the postmodern generation, does in discovery of what it means to be free. The prior generation was searching for what it meant to be good. This generation is searching for what it means to be free. And this is one of the keys to what it means to be free. And that's why I love it when finance and faith is talked about together. Because there has to be the freedom there when one is surrendered to the other. Faith, Love, Hope is an amazing moment. And this week or the weeks past, as a church staff, we always write down what we are going to give to the church because it's not just about the people of church moving it forward. The people on staff, we want to say that we're all in this together. And so Pastor Mark took up all the pledges of the staff, not all the school staff because there's another 300 over there, nor the early childhood learnings or kinder, just the church staff, the operations and the pastors. And we pledged, we had it written down, that the staff are going to give $180,073.50. An amazing amount. But I still want to know who wrote down 50 cents. People come to the amount they're going to give in a range of different ways, so don't question it. But I am believing for the resources to come into this house for every plan that God has envisioned to come to pass. Finances do put the wheels on the vision of God. We're all in this together. We're all moving forward. The Spirit of God is doing something in this house. Even in Acts chapter 2, I was reminded this afternoon that everyone came and gave all that they had. Ananias and Sapphira came and they sold their home too, and they gave half. Can you imagine selling your house in Brisbane right now? Half would be like $500,000. Yet they said then that moment, like Ananias and Sapphira were struck down. And so I'm not saying it's about the quantity. They gave a huge quantity, but they went against, they lied to the Holy Spirit, went against what the Spirit was doing. I am not saying bad things are going to happen if you don't give tonight, not at all. But I am saying the Spirit of God has an intent for a group of people in a certain time period. And he had that in Acts 2, and I still believe he has it for us tonight. So as we're moving into this, the Spirit of God is going to do something with what we bring tonight. My first question and what I'd considered is, what do we really believe? What do we really believe? Pastor Mark said this last week, that believing shapes the world around you. And I want to adjust our perception of believing as we start tonight, because I think there has been a subtle shift in our Western ideologies, reducing biblical faith to wishful thinking. Because I can walk outside and I can say, I believe that it's not going to rain today, but I might just bring my umbrella with me. And you might say, well, that's pragmatic. You might say you are being prepared, but you cannot say that I truly believe that it's not going to rain. Because belief has to have a certainty to it. It has to have an assuredness to it. Now, if I was going to say, I wish it wouldn't rain today, and I brought my umbrella, that would be an acceptable line of thinking. And so what I've seen happen in our time, in our age, that we have replaced biblical faith, assuredness in the things of God, with a wishful thinking of, I hope he shows up. What do you really believe? Because there are signs that follow your believing. Mark 16, verse 17 says this, these signs will follow those who believe. Whatever you believe, there are signs that follow your believing, regardless of it. And more I'm finding that it takes true courage to believe in the 21st century. It takes a courage to believe the things of God. It does not take courage to wish for the things of God. To wish that your family member can come to Christ is easy. You can say a few prayers in your bedroom. You can hope it takes place. But you don't have to have the hard conversations. You don't have to open your heart and reveal what the Spirit has done in you. You don't have to put yourself in a place of vulnerability. If you were to believe that a family member can meet Jesus, that takes courage, because you have to step out. You have to do things. You have to invite. You have to take physical steps. True believing requires courage. And we live in a time where people have grown a wishbone where a backbone should be. Faith always has accompanying works, but wishing doesn't. Faith always has accompanying works, but wishing can walk alone. And so you don't get what you wish for in life. You get what you believe. And you need to walk out your believing. On Faith, Love, Hope Sunday, I want to talk about the evidence of believing, and that is in our generosity. Our mission statement is to unmistakably influence our world for good and for God. And generosity is the pathway to that influence. Generosity is believing in action. And we see God's heart in this in one of the most famous scriptures. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Every act of generosity has a fruit. The greatest act of generosity had the greatest fruit. When God gave his only Son, there had to be a great fruit that came from that. The fruit that came from that act of generosity was salvation for humanity. With one act of generosity came the possibility of redemption for you and I. Every act of generosity has a fruit that can take place, and God models this. But God doesn't just do acts of generosity. And I would hate for you to think that tonight is about an act of generosity. Tonight is about more than that. It's an attitude of generosity. It's a character of generosity. Generosity is something that comes from within. It's built in to God's character. God is generous to his core. Do you realize the reason that we exist is because of God's generosity? Psalm 51 verse 12 says this, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me by your generous spirit." In God, We live, we move, and we have our being. We do not get to take one more breath unless God generously gives it to us. And the entitlement of our generation thinks, oh, I'll wake up tomorrow, it's my day. What I do with my time, my choice. But God gives breath, just like God breathed into dirt. He gave breath, and we have been, by his generous breath, we can now breathe. He gave the life of his son so that we can now live. God is generous at his very heart of what it always been, and every generous act has a fruit. You will notice that with God, it's not life temporary, it's life eternal. It's not life miserable, it's life abundant. Genesis says we were created in the image of God. And so if God has this generous part to his character, if we are created in his likeness, humanity should have a generous part to our character as well. And I love when science starts to prove the biblical truths that have been there for ages before it. I've read this study. It comes from one of the journals of the National Academy of Science. And I'll read this paragraph to you. It says, contemporary social neuroscience research shows that altruism is associated with specific pattern of brain activity. These studies indicate that the cerebral cortex, the area of the brain responsible for our most advanced cognitive functions, is deeply involved in altruistic behavior. 10 recent studies have shown that giving money and time in altruism triggers the brain's dopamine-rich reward system. It happens mostly in a region, and we need brain people for this, mostly a region called the striatum, which is the same area that lights up when you eat cake, good thing, listen to music, or engage in other satisfying activities. People get an even stronger sense of reward when they witness the positive impact of their gift, much like the joy you feel when you see your loved one's face light up as they unwrapped the perfect present. Studies also show that when people donated to charity or religious institutions, either financially or through volunteering, the something system, the portion of the brain responsible for feelings of reward was triggered. The brain releases feel-good chemicals, spurring you on to perform more kind acts. Something psychologists have now called the helper's high. And I say this because this is written into how we are designed to be. This isn't something that we've evolved to have. This is something that is in the likeness of God. We are created for good works. We are created to be generous. It's more than just a good idea. We're created for this. And this is countercultural because the world says, no, keep what you have in case someone takes it. Get more. The most powerful person is the person that can get most of everybody else. But this is saying something different. It's saying the generous people have the helper's high. That we are created for this. Jesus' first miracle, it wasn't a healing miracle or a deliverance miracle. It was at a wedding when they ran out of wine, and he did a generous act that made the hosts not be degraded in society but revered. Water into wine. Again, he fed the 5,000 people. He had just something small that a boy would bring, just a few fishes and a few loaves. And in the hands of God, it was multiplied. Everyone was fed, and 12 baskets were collected up. Way more afterwards than before, and 5,000 people were fed. And that I found is the effect of generosity in the hands of God. You take what you have and you give it to him, and then a multitude of people have been changed, and there's still more left over than when we started. That is the nature of generosity with God. He can't help himself. He is generous to the core, because generosity is far more than an action. It comes from what you believe. Isaiah 32 verse 8 says this, a generous man devises generous things, and by his generosity he shall stand. A generous person devises generous things. As in, this is planned out. This moment is not supposed to be some heartstring tugging, emotional expenditure. That is the whole wrong motive. It is a thought out process. A generous man devises generous things. A generous person has thought about it, has planned for it. Ruthie's my wife, and we long ago we have a line in our budget, we call it ministry money. And ministry money is how we bless others. We have it in our budget so that when people are in need, or when we need to shout someone a meal, or when something needs to happen, we're not always going backwards in our planning of our budget or going into the negative for the year, but we can easily expend it with a clear conscience, knowing that we have devised to bless people. That's what generous people do. You plan it. Because if it was up to our own desires and in the moment, we would have spent it on other things. We know human nature. The nature of the flesh always follows the path of least resistance. And so you need to put structures around your life that helps you spiral up towards God instead of spiraling down towards the world. I remember, it must be about 10 years ago, we had our life group. It was called Dance Party for, I don't really know what reason. My brother just named it that in the first night. And the first night we're there, we had myself and Ruthie and my brother and his wife. We had 4. And then about, I reckon, a year on in, we had about 53 people on Alvanto as this is our life group. About 34 would come every week. And we would feed them all. I don't know how we do that. It must have been like the loaves and fishes kind of thing. I could cook spaghetti bolognese, and so they had spaghetti bolognese every week. But I remember this one case. There's this one girl, I remember her name, but I won't repeat it. And she was going through a really rough time. And every week she would catch the bus to do this. She had a small daughter there. I think she was 2 or 3 years old. She would catch the bus and walk a long distance to life group and do the same home. And she would do the same to work each time. And Ruthie and I really felt from God to help buy this girl a car. And so our life group, who were very generous with us, they said, we said, we'll put in this much, and the life group matched the exact same amount. And so we saved up and we bought this car for this girl, and she was overjoyed, couldn't believe it. And she had about the car for about 2 weeks, and she wrote it off. I don't know, she had this insane crash, and it'll be one of the questions that I ask God when I get to heaven. What's the purpose of that? But even this car rolled, and it rolled down a hill end over end, and her and her daughter walked out without a scratch on them. And I don't know if it was just because the better car could have saved life. We'll never know the fruit of that, the end result of the giving on that. But generous people plan to be generous. It's not just some spontaneous moment that if I end up eventually seeing that person who can't pay for their groceries, then I'll do it. That's a great spontaneous moment of generosity. But Christians plan it. They plan to be generous with their time. They're generous with their worship. They're generous with their encouragement. They're generous with their prayer. And so there's 2 major characteristics of a generous spirit. These 2. A generous spirit sees possibility. And I love this one so much because it almost sounds like there's this creative effect to generosity. If you are generous, you see possibility everywhere. What could be, what can come into pass. If you aren't generous, all you see is impossibility. This won't happen because of these 5 reasons. This can't happen because I haven't seen it before. But generosity has this creative effect in our spirits and our lives that almost allows faith to rise and be like, what if? What if this could happen? Generous people are faith people. And I've always found that generosity and victimhood are enemies. And this is where, because the world is great at discipling victimhood. I don't know if you've seen this on social media, in the media. The world disciples victimhood. What about me? But don't you know about my pain? You have that pain and you got all that. But I've got a worse pain, so I should have more. Generosity and victimhood are at opposite ends of the spectrum. They cannot exist together. Now, victimhood makes your world get smaller and smaller and smaller because it's self-centric and you spiral inwards into yourself. Your world gets smaller. Generosity focuses on others. It makes you spiral out. It makes your world get larger and larger and expand and expand. Victimhood has deep roots in pride. But generosity has deep roots in humility. Victimhood is surrounded by darkness, but generosity shines the light in the darkness of a situation and breathes this divine possibility of what God can do in that space again. Never think that your act of generosity is just a physical act. Never think that you're just giving of something physical only exists in the physical plane. No, it is a spiritual weapon, and it creates opportunities for God's goodness to shine into the world. And everyone has enough to make a difference. 2 Peter 1:3 says this, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue. Been given enough. You've been given enough to prosper, to do well, to increase, to overcome, to influence. It's not about having more before you do something. It's what will you do with what you already have? What will you do with what is in your hand? And generous people see what they have and not compare it to the person next to them, but see what they have and see possibility with what God can do with it. A generous spirit is always looking for opportunity. I remember when I finished college, I wanted to buy a ute because utes were the thing to buy. Connor, you get it. Yeah. And I was like, no one has utes. No one in Australia really drives utes. And then I wanted to buy a ute. I was like, everybody in Australia drives a ute. Because you only see what you look for. And you only look for what is important to you. And the importance of something is driven by belief. That internal belief. What do you really believe? Generous people believe, and so they look for opportunities according to that importance. And when you look for opportunities to be generous, you will always find them. Generous people see possibilities. They have good ideas, new ideas, and their worlds grow larger and larger. But also a generous spirit sees beyond itself. A generous spirit sees beyond itself. One thing that we're trying to teach our daughter, she's 4, we may have tried to start this too early, is delayed gratification. I saw a video on Instagram of, I think it was a dad to his son. The son must have been about 5 or 6 years old, I'm guessing. And he offered him, he said, I will give you these 3 Oreos right now, or I will give you $1,000 tomorrow. Your choice. And the son obviously picks the 3 Oreos straight away. But I often think that's a good illustration of society right now. We want the little thing that we can see because we can't possibly fathom the glory of tomorrow. And this is what sowing and reaping is. This is the principle of sowing and reaping. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 10 says this, now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, both are important, supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. There's bread to eat. That God is a generous God and he will not have you go without. There is bread that you are supposed to eat, but there is seed that you are supposed to sow. Don't eat your seed. Eat the bread, sow the seed. Now, sowing is done in order to reach a place of reaping. You don't sow from a place of reaping, you sow to a place of reaping. If you want to have a season of reaping in your future, before it, you must have a season of sowing. Most people wait for a season of reaping before they try and sow, but if you ask a farmer, hey, have you planted any crops? No, I haven't. I'm just waiting for them to grow. That would be an illogical statement to make. Sowing and then reaping. And when you sow the seed, and Pastor Mark has this statement that he says, when you sow a seed, it leaves your hand, it blesses other people, and it does a full circle and returns later, and everyone is better off. And there's this sense of this, that when you sow a seed, it's also improving the future generations. The kingdom multiplies generationally. The kingdom advances generation to generation. That the generation that goes before us, we need to be standing on their shoulders. We don't need to be going backwards. If we go backwards from the generation before us, we don't need to be doing less than them. We need to be building on them. For the people in this room that are younger than me, I would be offended if you did less than me for the kingdom of God. If this church doesn't look infinitely better when you're running it. The kingdom advances generationally. When Pastor Mark arrived in Citipointe in the year 2000, it didn't have any air conditioning. This whole building would have looked completely different. And he had this vision that there would be thousands of people coming in to find Christ and thousands of people coming in here to be healed and set free and delivered. But it was hard to invite people when on a midsummer's day, you invite them and they just melt on the seat right next to you. because it's like the Citipointe sauna. You come in here and everyone's sweating and it's an unpleasant experience. And we would love it if people just walked in the door and they were instantly enraptured by who Jesus is. But for so many people, it's a process of walking with him before they fall in love with him for themselves. And sometimes they need some of these comforts or these things. They're for new people. And as we go through our projects and what we are believing for, things like, well, now the air conditioning is 24 years old. There's 5 big units up there. We need to replace one, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Apparently, these things cost money to maintain. And so as a church, we've stepped into such an incredible building. We've stepped into such an incredible legacy. But now it's our turn to keep this thing running, but not just keep it running, generationally advance this thing to a new level. And so 24 years ago, Pastor Mark did a moment. He's like, we need air conditioning. It's going to cost $780,000. That was back then. 24 years ago, it cost $780,000. And he said, next week we're going to take up a big offering. And so after that service, a man approached Pastor Mark and said, hey, I'd like to contribute toward the air conditioning. Pastor Mark said, that's great. You can do that at the info desk or whatever. And he goes, no, I'd like to pay for the whole air conditioning. Wow. And Pastor Mark says, that sounds great. But he said, I've got one condition. I've got one condition. So Pastor Mark, okay. When people have strings attached to their giving, okay. And he said, I don't want anyone to ever know that this money came from me. And this is, I think, is the heart of generosity. That we now stand in this place, not because of what a name did, but because of just what a member of Citipointe did. That saw a need in the house, saw the vision of the thousands of people that would walk through the doors and find Christ in here. That they wouldn't freeze in winter and they wouldn't melt in summer, but they could come here, be comfortable long enough that the aircon doesn't matter anymore, that they're here in their pursuit of Christ and the Holy Spirit for themselves. And he gave to that $780,000, and we walk in the fruit of that act of generosity. Our ceilings should be the next generation's floor. And faith takes courage. This is what I talk at the start. It takes courage to draw a line in the sand. Wishing for a better future is easy. Talking a pretty picture about a better future is easy. But faith takes courage. Hebrews 12 verse 1 says this. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set out before us. There's this sense that there is this whole crowd watching. That people who have run the race in the past, who have gone on to glory, are watching to see what this leg of the relay does. That this leg of the relay, this is a race that goes around the whole athletics track where baton passes to next runner. Well, what will we do with our turn? Because I have seen some legs. I'm an athletics fan. We got the Olympics coming up in 60 days. Who's counting? But I'll be glued to that thing. And I love watching the relays, especially in the days where Usain Bolt and the Jamaicans would do it. And there was one leg, you get it. And once Usain Bolt gets it, his leg of the relay, he leaves everyone. I would love for our leg of the relay, if we could just run this thing forward, that everyone looks at it and said, what was that? What did they do? How did they change the game? Are they on drugs? Generous people see opportunity. They see possibility. They see beyond themselves. They devise plans to give, to be generous, to advance the kingdom of God. And no one else will take the responsibility of seeing humanity saved. This is the church's foremost job. Our mission statement has 2 parts, for good and for God. We have 2 parts in it. Both are equally as important. As we go through this, to unmistakably influence our world for good and for God. Both are important. God is obviously important because we are the only ones who can outwork that, who can bring Christ. We are the local church, is the hope of the world. But Jesus was also always about good. His heart was for the poor, the marginalized. He said he came to do good. And so as a church, we must be around that as well. As the good that we do as a church is significant. Even internationally, if we look at our international care and aid, the stories that come out of our She Rescue Home, our It's Not Okay projects are phenomenal. That these girls who were on the street, whose future had no possibility. Remember we said a generous spirit sees possibility, sees opportunity. And these girls' lives who had no possibility, who were capped to generation after generation, were caught in this sex slavery because of generosity of this church. And this morning, as people came to the cross and they gave, I was overwhelmed with the faithfulness of our church. You are a faithful people. You are a generous people, that you may never see the faces, never see the fruit of your generosity, but people's lives are changed. And I look through the She Rescue Home and these amazing girls' lives who were changed because we give. We gave something. Even more locally, we have our Brisbane Community Care. We have people that come in through all our different community care projects, domestic violence support, practical assistance, marketplace and community care. We give away tons of free food every week at Citipointe West, tons, and free food just up the hill as well. The amount of families that come in and are able to live week to week because of your generosity. You may not know all that's what you accomplish as a church. You may just turn up and worship, and when a bucket comes around, you drop something in. You don't know what your seed is accomplishing. There is a harvest that is happening around about us. We do Christmas hampers every year, thousands of them. Because not all families get to have a fun Christmas. Sometimes Christmas is just another day where everyone else is celebrating and some families go hungry. And so we want to fix that, and we do. We have the Ivory Project where mums or families who have kids who are starting life rough get a bit of help from the church. We do amazing good as a church. We have the Red Frogs program. Where's Andy Gourlay? Can you stand up, Andy Gourlay? The Boss Frog is a legend. I wonder how many people's lives have been changed because that man said, yes, I'll do what God has asked me to do. I wonder what future ministries still lie in the heart of Citipointe that haven't yet been recognized, that will be recognized as we continue to give and grow. We have an incredible education process, and the more you see which way the world is going, the more you see the need for Christian education. If you capture the youth minds of a generation, you'll win that generation. We saw it in all these evil regimes of the past, but you see it for good as well. If we can bring Christian education, our childcares, our kindergartens, our colleges, if we can do that, then we make a real difference for good in this world.